Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jack Goldstone on the issue of global population trends. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of external affairs to the studio here in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Dr. Jack Goldstone. He is the Hazel Professor of Public Policy and Senior Scholar at George Mason University. He's also a fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andrew.
Jack, what is the current data on population growth telling us?
Well, we've had two surprises. We expected that all countries in the world would eventually follow the path of the more developed countries, which means as mortality went down, we would expect fertility to go down.
Right.
But the two surprises have been that in a lot of relatively low-income countries, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Brazil, fertility has fallen quite a bit faster than we expected. So these large, low-income countries are already down to replacement or below replacement fertility. So their population growth is slowing down and will likely end within 30 years or so.
Okay.
But there's an opposite surprise, and that is in Africa, the progress on reducing fertility has turned out to be much slower than anyone expected. We saw in the 1980s and 90s that fertility in Africa started to dip from about 6 children per family, a very high level,
right,
down to about 4 on average. But since then, it's kind of stalled. And so we expected African women to be down to about 2.5 to 3 children on average per family by now. Doesn't look like it's going to be anywhere near that. It's still at about 4. So Africa's growing faster than we expected. The rest of the world is slowing down faster.
And how is this affecting global politics or power relations between countries?
Well, this kind of unevenness of population growth is setting up a series of tensions and conflicts. If all the world were one big happy family and the entire world's population was distributed as one, you'd look at the overall age structure and you'd say, yeah, there's a good balance there between aging population, adult working population, and children. But it's not balanced, right? We've cut the world up into competing nation states.
Right.
And so some areas, Japan, Europe, even China, are aging very quickly. Their fertility has been low for the last 20 years.
Right.
So that corner of the world, or those corners of the world, are getting older. That means it's harder for them to pay for economic expansion. And in Europe, it's already harder for them to staff and finance their militaries, and everybody's going to have to pay more for pensions and health care, right?
Yep.
But there are other parts of the world, and this includes parts of the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, that are still growing very strongly and where the population is very young. And that means those areas are going to become centers for outmigration, probably chronic civil conflict,
right,
and will face quite substantial challenges in educating and providing jobs for all their young people.
Well, and perhaps we can focus on this question of social conflict. What is the relationship between population growth and civil unrest?
Research in the last 20 years has shown a surprisingly strong relationship between progress in what we call the demographic transition, that is moving to a more mature age structure with a adult-heavy kind of population balance.
Right.
Fewer children, more adults, more people working, more people educated. Those countries tend to be quite stable and to have a better chance of creating a stable democratic government.
Right.
On the other hand, research has also shown that countries with a large percentage of young people, a relatively low average age, say the average age being under 25, countries in that situation tend to have recurrent civil conflict, a higher degree of violence, and a much harder time maintaining stable democracy.
Right.
Essentially, that recurrent violence leads to a demand for authoritarian rule just to provide security.
Right.
So as the world divides up, we're seeing democracy spread as much of the world ages and matures, but we're also seeing a really distressing degree of turmoil, refugee problems, and civil violence in places like the Middle East, Iraq, and
Right.
Yemen, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where countries are still facing very young populations.
And what is the impact of, or the potential impacts of this population growth on climate change?
Well, that is a difficult question to answer. Climate change is driven mainly by greenhouse gases. The two most potent are carbon dioxide and methane.
Right.
Now, the rich countries in the world are trying to get their carbon dioxide emissions under control. Europe has made great progress. North America, not quite so much. Other parts of the world, China and India, are still struggling to get a handle on it. The real issue, though, for me, is what's going to happen to the population in the fastest growing area of the world, and that's Africa.
Right.
Right now, Africans are extremely low energy consumers. That's what poverty does, unfortunately.
Yep.
So I'm hopeful that Africans will become stronger consumers of energy and that they'll have access to things to improve their lives. However, if they produce the power they need through fossil fuel burning, that's going to really ramp up the pressures for global climate change.
Right.
Because Africa's contribution now is tiny. The average African contributes only 1/20th as much carbon per person as the average Chinese. So if Africa starts to catch up to China, even if Europe and America and China do their best to reduce carbon output, rising carbon output in Africa will overwhelm everything.
Right.
So it's absolutely essential now, given the expected growth of the African middle class and the swelling of its population, Africa needs to get on a trajectory of renewable energies, probably faster than any other place in the world.
And the international system that we have in place is really an outgrowth or a legacy of the Second World War. And you've argued that this population growth is putting tremendous strain on the existing system as we know it. How so?
Well, what is a set of institutions for global governance? It's a way to organize the countries of the world to respond to challenges and crises. Now, the challenges we faced in the immediate aftermath of World War II were rebuilding a Europe that had been shattered and encouraging countries around the world to gradually join the community of nations.
Right.
And so the United Nations was established for that. We also wanted to avoid the terrible bouts of depression and inflation that had preceded the Second World War. So the victors after World War II also got together and created a set of global financial institutions. The Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all of which were designed to help countries avoid or respond to economic crises. So we had a political branch in the United Nations and economic branches as well. And there have been others that have sprung up since then. The agreement on trade and tariffs that has grown into the World Trade Organization. Now, all of these institutions are somewhat voluntary. They don't have large forces to compel acquiescence.
Right.
So the effectiveness of these institutions depends on whether countries around the world see them as legitimate, see whether there's an advantage to participating.
Right.
We've seen with the World Court in The Hague, a lot of countries choose not to participate, and that weakens it.
Yep.
So far, we've had pretty good participation in IMF, World Bank, United Nations, but what's happened with the shift of global population growth away from Europe and America, which are now aging and their economies are slowing down, and the rapid growth in population, in youthful labor force, and the growth of the economy in places like Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, the countries that dominated these global institutions no longer effectively dominate the world economy, and they certainly are a shrinking fraction of world population.
Right.
If you are a Brazil or even a China, and you say, look, my country's got one of the 10 largest economies in the world. We're contributing more to global growth and will for the next 20 or 30 years than Europe, because Europe has slowed down, right? But in fact, you look at these institutions and the IMF, the World Bank, United Nations, Permanent Security Council, they're all pretty much dominated by Europe and the United States, these aging countries. So we've got an imbalance, and what we're seeing is that China is trying to develop its own set of global institutions now. The Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank is going to be China's effort to build something like its own Asia Development Bank. We saw Turkey and Brazil try to develop their own diplomacy to deal with problems in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has now taken the lead role in military pacification in Yemen. It's not a NATO issue. We feel we can't handle it.
Yep.
it doesn't help the world if you've got half a dozen different actors, each trying to go their own way and control their own regional problems, because then the world starts to break into separate trading blocs, competitive security blocs. The great thing about NATO is that it united a lot of different countries that had a similar outlook and a shared interest in making the world safe for trade and security.
Yep.
We now need to grow that NATO-based security network to incorporate more countries around the world. NATO, after all, has been active in Afghanistan, they've been active in the Middle East, they've been active in Africa.
Yep.
We need allies in these regions. So I'm encouraging people to think about expanding NATO into a broader global democratic military alliance for peacekeeping and security. We need to think about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank admitting representatives from countries like Brazil, Nigeria, China, India to the very highest ranks of leadership,
right,
and break that monopoly of Europe and the US. Otherwise, large countries will look at that and say, those institutions don't serve our interests,
sure,
and we're not going to participate or play by their rules.
And just getting back to the issue of population growth, how are we currently governing global population? What are the institutions that are most active on this particular issue?
Well, it's a real deficiency, frankly.
Okay.
There are two big issues, maybe three, in population. One is who's doing something about continued growth in the numbers of people. Second is, what are we doing about the movement of people
right,
around the world across borders? And what are we doing about refugees, people by the tens of millions who are forced out of their homes? Okay. We're actually, in some ways, doing the best job on refugees.
Okay.
The United Nations does stand up as the lead organization for global support for refugees, and the United Nations coordinates multilateral efforts. So the refugees now from places like Syria have been able to find homes outside their country thanks to the efforts of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
Right.
Asylum laws have also been helpful. So in a sense, the worst problem is the one that's gotten the best support. But we really don't have a good global regime for the rights of economic migrants.
Right.
Right? You have millions of workers from Southeast Asia working in the Gulf countries. They have little rights or protections. They can be threatened with deportation at any time. Migrants to Europe face a variety of different asylum and migration regimes in different countries. There's no European body. There is for refugees, but there's no European body for economic migrants
right,
that sets rules for what are your rights as a migrant, who protects those rights, what do you have access to for European citizenship. It's all done in different ways by national governments. And in fact, the burden can be terrible because under EU rules, the country where an immigrant lands has first responsibility for them.
Right.
So Italy, which is not terribly well equipped, not as well, say, as Germany to deal with immigrants, the fact that they're closest to North Africa means the burden of North African conflict and people looking to leave North Africa, not necessarily as war refugees, but
right,
just fleeing chaos to try and seek work. If they land in Italy, they are Italy's responsibility, and the same for Spain. Now, for overall rate of population growth, well, as I said, the good news is in most countries in the world, population growth rates are already going down.
right,
It's really just sub-Saharan Africa and a few countries in the Middle East, South Asia, Central America that still have exceptionally high growth rates. Now, there's no global organization that deals with this, and indeed, it runs into problem because you've got national sovereignty. Countries feel they have the right to deal
right,
with their population, and you certainly have issues of women's rights and family privilege, and you don't want to start interfering.
right,
In an ideal world, families and women everywhere would have a free choice, and contraceptive materials, if they wish them, would be available.
right,
And care for their health in reproductive stage of their life would be quite good and supportive. Now, we don't have that.
right,
So the things that I think the global community needs to do is focus on women's rights, women's health, and reproductive health, and free choice. If you combine that with an improvement in women's education to really
right,
empower women to make and enforce their own choices, I think that's the family policy, the population policy that we need. Within that framework, countries can adapt as they wish. I think the biggest problem we've had in recent years is the United States, which
right,
exercises leadership,
yep,
has kind of swung back and forth. Democratic regimes have generally been supportive of providing family planning as part of a broader program of women's health and global reproduction rights.
Right.
Whereas Republican regimes have restricted what the U.S. can do and said, we're not going to participate even in basic health programs unless we remove the family planning component.
Right.
And so people therefore kind of get mixed signals. They don't know what to do. So I think if we can simply be consistent in support for women's rights, support for women's health, support for women's education, and then allow nations to forge their own policies within that framework, that'll be fine. I think, let me just say, the big problem is, I mean, women's rights is a huge problem everywhere, but the big problem for global governance, I think right now, is global migration flows.
Right.
Because those are set to escalate, and we really have a lack of institutions to protect migrants.
Well, and just on, I mean, how are governments, particularly in the developed world, responding to this increase in migration? And I mean, one of the laws of economics, people will go where the opportunities are.
Right.
And we've had significant migration from the developing world to the developed world for at least half a century, if not more. If this trend is on the rise, how are governments in the developed world responding?
Okay, well, you're here in Canada.
Right.
Let's say in my left hand, I offered you $100 US.
Okay.
In my right hand, I offer you $200 in Mexican pesos.
Yes.
Which would you take?
I would take the first option.
The $100?
Yes.
Why not take the $200 in equivalent in Mexican pesos?
Because of the prospect of greater opportunities in the U.S.
Well, you can go to the bank and cash those 200 pesos in for, I mean, the $200 worth of pesos in for $200 Canadian right away.
Oh, I see. Right.
I'm not saying you have to move to Mexico to pick it up.
Gotcha. Well, I would take the more money then.
Yeah. But it is a little bit confusing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The context kind of troubles you.
Yeah.
We have the same issues with regard to migration.
Okay.
The skills of migrants from Mexico, Central America, even from Nigeria and Ghana, that's money offered to us. People are willing to bring their skills, their entrepreneurial energy, their ambition.
Right.
They want to take the skills that they have, the ambition, their motivation, and put it to use where they can get the highest return. Right. And that's going to be in Europe or in America, increasingly also now in China.
Yep.
But countries look at that money in hand and say, well, wait a minute, it's associated with things that we don't quite trust, or that we don't understand, or that's not familiar. And so we're kind of closing the door and saying, no, keep your ambition, keep your skill, we're going to be okay without it. And I think that is a terrible mistake.
Right.
Now, you've illustrated how people have this misunderstanding. And some of these misunderstandings are immigrants take jobs away. They don't. All the research shows that if an immigrant comes and gets a job, it's usually in a construction or low-skilled enterprise that people often wouldn't take, or you're looking at a professional immigrant who fills a niche in nursing, in medicine, in scientific research, where there are not enough local workers. So there's usually not a direct competition for jobs. And then once the migrant comes here and has a job, hey, that person needs to pay rent. They need to buy food. They need to get their hair cut.
Right.
They need to get their dry cleaning done. So that provides jobs for people here. Migration is almost always win-win. Now, there's anxiety these days about jihadis and Muslim immigrants.
Yep.
You know, you worry about that 1 in 1,000 person who might be dangerous. And for that, we do have means to check backgrounds. We do have means to monitor people. We have to all the time. We monitor people who come in on student visas, family visas.
Right.
But for some reason, we won't give work visas to people because we're afraid of this job issue. The other problem is people are afraid that people won't blend in. You know, foreigners will stay foreign.
Right.
That depends heavily on the policies of the country of destination. The United States has actually been quite successful integrating migrants.
Right.
And once European countries accepted migrants as these are part of us, they're here to stay. They're growing up in our country, their kids are going to our schools, we want them to succeed.
Yep.
And once you take that attitude, we want migrants to succeed, they find that it's worth their while to assimilate much better.
Right.
If you treat migrants as, well, we just want you to work for a few years and then go home, why should they invest in learning a language and learning the institutions, right? So it's really all about what's the opportunity for countries to benefit from migration? How do you turn it into a plus? We've learned you can turn it into a minus. right? You can create migration rules that are discriminatory, you can treat migrants as unwanted, and you can make it hard for them to assimilate and blend in. All of that creates problems. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be a real win-win situation.
Right. Shifting focus a little bit to China. And of course, China has had the one-child policy for decades now. And what are some of the challenges that come with this policy? And then building on that, do you think that that kind of extreme response to population growth might be adopted in other jurisdictions?
Well, I don't think it will be adopted anywhere. And the reason is it was very unpopular in China. It was widely seen to have led to some scandalous abuses. There were, coerced sterilizations, terrible suffering for families. That's not going to be repeated. The world has clearly frowned upon that.
Right.
And it's unnecessary. Most of the big countries like Brazil and India and Indonesia are already experiencing a decline in fertility.
Right.
Sub-Saharan Africa, do they have very high birth rates? Would they benefit from a more restrictive policy? Perhaps, but it's a very difficult policy to enforce unless you've got a really efficient bureaucratic government. You don't have that anywhere, really, in Africa. So it's not going to happen again. What's more, China is paying a very high price for that policy. They didn't think ahead. What we see is a whole bunch of social ills. First, you have a whole generation of spoiled only children who are referred to as little emperors, who are used to having their parents dote on them and are not growing up with much of a sense of sacrifice and cooperation and give and take. You grow up with a brother or a sister, you learn to share. You grow up as an only child, it's a different process. So that's a problem. Second, China is dealing with this inverted pyramid where they say, one child, 2 parents, 4 grandparents. It's almost always the woman who is responsible for caring for elders in the Chinese families. And this burden now is getting severe. You're seeing this kind of crunch of the single child who's looking upward at having multiple elders to support. So that imbalance is going to put a bigger burden on the government to step in and start to contribute to pension and health care.
Right.
And lastly, China's labor force and military are already being impacted by this because the number of 18 to 20-year-olds entering the labor force has started to drop and will continue to drop for the next 20 to 30 years very sharply. So China's economic growth, which was driven by simply taking more and more low-cost labor and moving it into factories and cities, that model simply won't work. That's one of the reasons China's economy has suddenly dropped from 9% to 7% and will probably drop further. All the growth in China's economy now must come from productivity increases. It no longer can come from simply adding more labor to the manufacturing or service workforce.
Right. And just to wrap up, in your view, are governments paying attention to this issue? Are they taking it seriously or seriously enough, given where the numbers are going?
It's a very good question. You see a lot of coverage now in the press. Almost every day I see something in the newspapers or in the magazines. I would say some more than others. In Japan, the government has practically declared a national crisis for dealing with aging and depopulation of rural areas.
Right.
They are very actively looking at ways to move population instead of into the cities, kind of back into some of the countryside areas. How do you provide support for the elderly? The Japanese don't want to do it with immigrant labor. They want to do it with robots. They've told me, we'd rather have robots take care of us than foreigners.
Right.
Now that's a huge challenge. I don't know if they're going to make it, but they have kind of a crash program to develop automated elderly care and support and prevent the countryside from emptying out. Whether they'll succeed or not, I don't know, because it's really only been in the last 12 to 15 months that it's become a priority national policy. So other countries are trying to boost fertility. So Korea, Taiwan, Russia, France, they're all trying to promote family-friendly policies to bring the birth rate up to or beyond replacement. And the other issue, though, is that in Africa, where you say, hey, there's a population there of 500 million, it could go to 1 billion or 2 billion by the end of the century, nobody has woken up to that because the data have just surprised us in the last couple of years.
Right.
And so I would say we're kind of rocked back on our heels thinking, what's going to happen if Nigeria hits 400 or 500 million people? What happens if Uganda hits 90 million people? How are we going to deal with that? I would say people haven't even begun to accept the reality, much
Right.
less formulate solutions.
Jack, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Well, unfortunately, there are endless puzzles involved in dealing with this issue.
Great. And thank you to our audience for watching. You have been watching Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.
States.
Right.
And so some areas, Japan, Europe, even China, are aging very quickly. Their fertility has been low for the last 20 years.
Right.
So that corner of the world, or those corners of the world, are getting older. That means it's harder for them to pay for economic expansion, and in Europe, it's already harder for them to staff and finance their militaries, and everybody's going to have to pay more for pensions and health care, right?
Yep.
But there are other parts of the world, and this includes parts of the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, that are still growing very strongly and where the population is very young. And that means those areas are going to become centers for outmigration, probably chronic
international public policy, or some other aspect of external affairs to the studio here in Waterloo. Today my guest is Dr. Jack Goldstone. He is the Hazel Professor of Public Policy and Senior Scholar at George Mason University. He's also a fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andrew.
Jack, what is the current data on population growth telling us?
Well, we've had two surprises. We expected that all countries in the world would eventually follow the path of the more developed countries, which means as mortality went down, we would expect fertility to go down.
Right.
But the two surprises have been that in a lot of relatively low-income countries, India down to about 2.5 to 3 children on average per family by now, doesn't look like it's going to be anywhere near that. It's still at about 4. So Africa's growing faster than we expected. The rest of the world is slowing down faster.
And how is this affecting global politics or power relations between countries?
Well, this kind of unevenness of population growth is setting up a series of tensions and conflicts. If all the world were one big happy family and the entire world's population was distributed as one, you'd look at the overall age structure and you'd say, yeah, there's a good balance there between aging population, adult working population, and children. But it's not balanced, right? We've cut the world up into competing nations.
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jack Goldstone on the issue of global population trends. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance.
Indonesia, Vietnam, Brazil. Fertility has fallen quite a bit faster than we expected. So these large, low-income countries are already down to replacement or below replacement fertility. So their population growth is slowing down and will likely end within 30 years or so.
Okay.
But there's an opposite surprise, and that is in Africa, the progress on reducing fertility has turned out to be much slower than anyone expected. We saw in the 1980s and 90s that fertility in Africa started to dip from about 6 children per family, a very high level,
Right.
down to about 4 on average. But since then, it's kind of stalled. And so we expected African women to be down